For decades, the files were classified, some for 50 years, some longer. What's inside them? The names, the operations, the things the government did in your name that you were never supposed to know. It's all public record. Tonight, 101 of them, starting with the ones they'd hoped you'd never actually read. My name is Wes. This is Sleepy American History. Sit back, get comfortable, and let's dig in.
The CIA has released over 30 million pages of declassified documents. Most people will never read a single one. But buried in those pages are the kinds of stories that make you sit up in bed and whisper, "Wait, what?" And then immediately lie back down because it's late and you have things to do tomorrow. There's a story in there about a cat that cost $20 million. About a man named James who spent 20 years handing America's most sensitive secrets to its greatest enemy and never once took a polygraph. About a chef you almost certainly know and the spy network she quietly helped run. So get comfortable, pull that blanket up, and let's talk about what they finally declassified. Starting with the man who started it all. 1. George Washington's Secret Army. So here's the thing about George Washington that the history books sort of gloss over. The man was a genuinely gifted spy master. While everyone was focused on the battlefields, Washington was quietly running one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations of the entire Revolutionary War era. The Culper Ring, his network of spies operating across Long Island and New York City, used invisible ink, layered numerical codes, dead drops, and even laundry hung on clotheslines as signals. It was meticulous, patient, and surprisingly modern. Here's the thing that really makes you pause, though. The network was so carefully protected that historians didn't confirm some of its members' identities until the 1930s. That's over a century and a half of successful secrecy. For a man famous for his honesty, Washington had an extraordinary talent for making sure nobody knew anything they weren't supposed to know. 2. The spy who was returned to slavery. There's a particular kind of injustice that history sometimes buries quietly, and here's the thing about James Fayette. His story deserves to be told slowly. Fayette was an enslaved African-American man who volunteered to serve under the Marquis de Lafayette during the Revolutionary War. He operated as a double agent inside the commands of both Benedict Arnold and Lord Cornwallis, gathering intelligence that was later credited as instrumental to the American victory at Yorktown. He risked everything. He helped change the outcome of the war, and when it was over, he was returned to slavery. Lafayette, who had fought alongside him, personally petitioned the Virginia legislature for his freedom in 1786. James Fayette was finally freed in 1787. His portrait was later painted alongside Lafayette himself, a quiet acknowledgement of a debt that had taken far too long to repay. 3. Julia Child, Secret Agent. Now here's a name you probably weren't expecting to appear in a documentary about American intelligence. Julia Child, yes, the Julia Child, the one who would later teach a generation of Americans how to properly handle a chicken, worked for the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. The OSS was the wartime intelligence agency that would later evolve into the CIA. Child worked in its research and development division, processing documents and coordinating information flow. The OSS, incidentally, was staffed with so many academics, lawyers, and Ivy League graduates that critics mockingly nicknamed it "oh so social." Here's the thing, though. Whatever the critics thought of its pedigree, the organization did serious work, and Child was a serious part of it. She'd spend the next few decades teaching people to cook, but for a time she was quietly helping keep secrets. 4. The CIA's first director and the UFO question. Most people assume the CIA was always a cool, calculating institution that dealt strictly in hard intelligence. And then here's the thing about Roscoe Hillenkoetter. Hillenkoetter was the CIA's very first director, a appointed when the agency was formally created by the National Security Act of 1947. He served in that role during the earliest, most formative years of American intelligence. And then, after he left, he went before Congress and publicly testified that UFOs were, and this is his language, real, not visionary or fictitious. He became an advocate for taking unidentified aerial phenomena seriously at a time when doing so was not exactly a career-enhancing move. Whether you find that fascinating or puzzling probably says something about you. What's undeniable is that the man who first ran the CIA apparently felt there was something worth paying attention to in the sky. 5. The budget nobody was supposed to see. Government budgets are, by design, fairly public documents. Agencies request money, Congress debates it, numbers get published. Here's the thing about the CIA's budget, though. For decades, the actual figure was one of the most carefully guarded secrets in Washington. So, the CIA's classified black budget funds, covert operations, intelligence infrastructure, and programs most Americans never hear about. For years, the official government position was that even confirming the existence of a specific number would compromise national security. And then in 2013, a document leaked by Edward Snowden accidentally revealed an approximate figure, around $15 billion annually. The government never formally confirmed it. They didn't really deny it either. It just sort of sat there in the public record, an accidental answer to a question that had never officially been asked, which is, when you think about it, a very CIA kind of outcome. 6. The 50-year secret in the cables. Here's the thing about Venona. It's one of the most consequential intelligence programs in American history, and most people have never heard of it. Beginning in 1943, the NSA quietly worked to decrypt Soviet intelligence communications that had been intercepted during the 1940s. The program ran for nearly 40 years and wasn't publicly revealed until 1995. What it found was genuinely remarkable. The decrypted cables confirmed that Julius Rosenberg was indeed a Soviet spy. They also identified dozens of other Americans who had been passing classified information to the USSR. People embedded at the State Department, the Treasury, and even the Manhattan Project. For years, some of those identifications were politically contested. Venona made the debates considerably less theoretical. The cables had been sitting in classified archives, patient as old paper, waiting for the world to finally be allowed to read them. 7. The director who was fired and then investigated his boss's murder. Allen Dulles ran the CIA longer than anyone else ever has. From 1953 to 1961, a full 8 years. Under his leadership, the agency overthrew the governments of Iran and Guatemala, launched repeated attempts against Fidel Castro, and organized the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. Here's the thing, though. The Bay of Pigs was a significant failure, and President Kennedy fired him for it. That, by any reasonable standard, should have been the end of Dulles's proximity to history's most sensitive moments. Instead, after Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, Dulles was appointed to the Warren Commission, the body tasked with investigating Kennedy's death. The man Kennedy had fired was now part of the official inquiry into Kennedy's killing. History occasionally has a very dry sense of irony. 8. The mole hunter who caught no moles. James Angleton was the CIA's chief of counterintelligence from 1954 to 1975, and the story of his tenure is one of the stranger chapters in American intelligence history. Angleton became deeply convinced, some would say obsessed, that the CIA had been penetrated by a Soviet mole at a high level. Here's the thing. His response to that belief was a 20-year internal purge that destroyed careers, shut down operations, and created an atmosphere of profound institutional paranoia. Officers were investigated, sidelined, and professionally ruined based on suspicion alone. And when Angleton was finally forced to resign in 1974, the mole he was most certain existed had never been found. The troubling postscript is that actual Soviet penetrations may have continued while Angleton was busy pursuing the wrong leads. The mole he was looking for was, in a sense, the mole hunt itself. 9. The paper trail behind every secret war. There's a particular kind of bureaucratic discipline built into American covert operations that most people don't know about, and here's the thing. It's actually kind of reassuring, depending on your perspective. Every covert operation conducted by the CIA must be authorized in writing by the President of the United States. This authorization is called a finding, and it exists specifically to ensure that someone at the very top has formally approved whatever is about to happen. In theory, nothing is done in the shadows without a paper trail leading back to the Oval Office. In practice, those documents are among the most classified in the entire U.S. government, locked away at classification levels that make them nearly impossible to access through any public process. The accountability is real. The transparency is not, which is perhaps a reasonable description of how covert operations are supposed to work. 10. The committee that opened the files. By the mid-1970s, something had quietly shifted in the relationship between Congress and the intelligence community. Enough rumors had surfaced, enough whistleblowers had spoken quietly in enough hallways that a formal investigation became unavoidable. Here's the thing about the Church Committee. When it convened between 1975 and 1976, it became the first full congressional investigation of U.S. intelligence activities ever conducted. What it found was extraordinary. Assassination plots against foreign leaders, domestic surveillance programs with no legal authority, the deliberate targeting of American civil rights organizations, MKUltra, COINTELPRO, Operation Chaos. The reforms that followed included the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, a genuine attempt to establish legal boundaries around what intelligence agencies could do to American citizens. Those boundaries were later substantially narrowed after September 11, 2001. The Church Committee's files remain some of the most important historical documents of the 20th century. If this kind of history is something you'd like more of, hitting subscribe means you'll catch every new episode. We put these out regularly, and there's always something stranger just around the corner. Now, let's keep going. 11. The coup that cost $2 million and 40 years, Guatemala, 1954. Here's the thing about Operation PB success. It is a case study in how a relatively modest intelligence investment can generate consequences that outlast everyone involved by decades. The CIA organized the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz, Guatemala's democratically elected president, after he proposed nationalizing land owned by the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with significant political connections in Washington. The entire operation cost approximately $2,700,000. It involved a radio disinformation campaign, a small makeshift air force, and the coordination of a military coup that brought down the government within 2 weeks. The military dictatorship that followed and the civil war that eventually grew from that instability resulted in the deaths of an estimated 200,000 people over the next 40 years. $2,700,000. 40 years, 200,000 lives. The math of covert operations is rarely tidy. 12. The oil company, the Shah, and the modern Middle East. And if Guatemala illustrated one kind of consequence, here's the thing about what happened in Iran the year before. It illustrated something even larger. In 1953, the CIA and British intelligence service MI6 jointly organized the overthrow of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh had nationalized Iranian oil, which had been controlled by Anglo-Persian oil, a company that would later become BP. The CIA paid approximately $1 million to Iranian military officers, organized street demonstrations, and coordinated the removal of Mossadegh from power. The Shah was restored to the throne. For a while, that looked like a success. Here's the thing, though. The resentment that built over the following decades contributed directly to the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the hostage crisis, and the geopolitical tensions that have defined the Middle East ever since. $1 million in 1953, a region reshaped for generations. 13. The journalists who weren't just journalists. Here's a question that probably never occurred to most newspaper readers in the 1950s. Is this reporter actually a reporter? It sounds a little paranoid. And yet, here's the thing about Operation Mockingbird. It was real, it was extensive, and it ran for years. Beginning in the early 1950s, the CIA cultivated a network of American journalists, editors, and media figures who functioned as intelligence assets. The program placed stories favorable to CIA interest in major newspapers, wire services, and magazines. At its height, the program reportedly had assets across some of the most influential outlets in the country. The Church Committee confirmed the program's existence in the mid-1970s. Chupwise, the full scope of who was involved and what was published has never been officially released. Most of the detailed records remain classified. The short version, for at least a decade, some of what you read in the newspaper was written with government approval. 14. The illegal files on 7,000 Americans. The CIA has a legal mandate that is, at least in writing, fairly clear. It operates abroad. Domestic intelligence is the FBI's territory. Here's the thing about Operation Chaos, though, which ran from 1967 to 1974. It operated at home, on Americans, without any legal authority to do so. The program compiled files on approximately 7,200 American citizens and over 1,000 domestic organizations suspected of having foreign ties. The targets included anti-war groups, civil rights organizations, and student movements. The CIA was doing this at the same time the FBI was running its own parallel surveillance program, COINTELPRO, against many of the same people. Two separate federal agencies operating simultaneously, both monitoring American citizens without legal authority, apparently without meaningful awareness of each other's overlap. The era of accountability hadn't quite arrived yet. 15. The letters that were never supposed to be sent COINTELPRO is one of those acronyms that sounds almost mundane until you understand what it actually did. The FBI's counterintelligence program ran from 1956 to 1971, and here's the thing. Its tactics went well beyond monitoring. The program targeted a wide range of American political organizations: the Communist Party, the Black Panther Party, the American Indian Movement, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and others. Tactics included forged documents designed to create distrust within organizations, coordination with local law enforcement to pursue false arrests, and the cultivation of paid informants inside civil rights groups. The SCLC, the organization led by Martin Luther King Jr., was among the most heavily surveilled. An anonymous letter sent to Dr. King by the FBI, discovered years later, urged him to take his own life. The program was only exposed after activists broke into an FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania in 1971 and leaked the files to the press. 16. The rocket scientists with complicated pasts. Operation Paperclip is one of those chapters in post-war history that tends to generate very complicated feelings. And here's the thing. That's probably appropriate. After World War II, the United States brought over 1,600 German scientists and engineers to America under a program that involved falsifying or omitting parts of their records. Among them was Wernher von Braun, who became a central figure in in the American space program and a genuine hero of the Apollo era. He had also used forced labor from concentration camps at the Mittelwerk rocket facility during the war. Arthur Rudolph, another key NASA figure who helped design the Saturn V rocket, similarly supervised forced labor during wartime production. Rudolph surrendered his American citizenship in 1984 rather than face prosecution. The rockets that took Americans to the moon were real achievements. The history behind the men who built them is genuinely complicated. 17. The experiments nobody consented to MKUltra is perhaps the most discussed and least comfortably digested chapter in CIA history. And here's the thing. The discomfort is entirely justified. Beginning in 1953, the CIA ran a research program designed to explore whether human behavior could be manipulated or controlled through chemical, biological, or psychological means. Experiments were conducted on American and Canadian civilians without their knowledge or consent. Frank Olson, a government scientist, died in 1953. The official report concluded that he had ended his own life. His family disputed that finding after a forensic re-examination in 1994. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the program's files destroyed. Approximately 80% were eliminated before a separate cache was discovered in 1977 during a records audit. What the surviving documents revealed was enough. A Senate subcommittee held hearings. The full picture of what was done and to how many people remains incomplete because most of the records are simply gone. 18. The $20 million cat. Every once in a while. So, history offers a story that sounds like it was invented, and yet here's the thing about Project Acoustic Kitty. Every detail of it is real. In the 1960s, the CIA spent approximately $20 million on a program designed to use cats as mobile surveillance platforms. The concept, surgically implant listening devices and antennas into live cats, then deploy them near targets to pick up conversations. Cats, of course, are famously cooperative animals with a deep loyalty to mission parameters. The first field test involved guiding the implanted cat toward a target location near a park bench. The cat immediately wandered away from the target and was struck by a passing taxi. The program was terminated. The CIA's official internal assessment reportedly described the concept as simply not practical. $20 million is a great deal of money to spend arriving at that particular conclusion. 19. So, the government psychic's remote viewing sounds like something from a late-night television special, and here's the thing. The U.S. government funded it seriously for nearly 2 decades. Operation Stargate ran from 1978 to 1995 under the management of the Defense Intelligence Agency and, later, the CIA. The program employed individuals who claimed the ability to perceive distant locations, objects, or events through extrasensory means. It cost approximately $20 million. Participants would be given coordinates or sealed envelopes and asked to describe what was there. The program's supporters argued it produced occasional genuine results. A 1995 independent review commissioned to evaluate the program concluded it had generated no reliable intelligence that couldn't have been obtained through conventional means. Congress quietly ended funding shortly after. Somewhere in a government archive, there is a file full of psychic sketches that the Defense Intelligence Agency paid for. That file is real. 20. The secret ship that stole a submarine. And to close out this first stretch of history, here's the thing about Project Azorian. It is one of the most technically audacious covert operations ever attempted, and it almost worked. In 1974, the CIA used a specially constructed ship called the Glomar Explorer to attempt to raise a sunken Soviet submarine from the floor of the Pacific Ocean. At a depth of 17,000 feet. The ship had been built undercover as a Howard Hughes deep-sea mining venture which is objectively a remarkable cover story. The operation partially succeeded. The submarine broke apart during the recovery, but the CIA retrieved code books and recovered the remains of Soviet sailors. Those sailors were given a filmed burial at sea, footage that was later presented to Russian officials after the Cold War ended. They raised a submarine from 17,000 feet of ocean and still found a way to be respectful about it. We're 20 facts into this long, quiet journey through America's secret history, and if you're still with us, your breathing has probably slowed just a little. Maybe your eyes feel a bit heavier than they did 20 minutes ago. That's how it's supposed to feel. The stories will keep going. You don't have to chase them, just let them come to you. 21. The spy who drove a Jaguar. There's a particular kind of audacity that comes from believing nobody's paying attention. And here's the thing about Aldrich Ames. People really weren't paying attention, at least not for a very long time. Ames was a CIA counterintelligence officer with 31 years inside the agency. In 1985, he began passing classified information to the Soviet Union. Over the following 9 years, his betrayals led to the identification and execution of at least 10 CIA assets, real people working in dangerous places who were exposed and killed. During this entire period, Ames was driving a Jaguar and purchasing a $500,000 home in cash on a government salary. Colleagues noticed. Nobody formally reported it. The internal culture, by several accounts, made raising concerns about a senior officer feel more like insubordination than due diligence. He was finally arrested in 1994. By then, the damage had been done quietly, expensively, and for nearly a decade. 22 years of damage, 0 polygraphs. If the Ames case was troubling, here's the thing about Robert Hansen. His story is somehow even harder to explain away. So, Hansen was an FBI agent who spied for the Soviet Union and later Russia from 1979 to 2001. 22 years. He is considered the most damaging spy in FB1 history. Among the things he revealed, the existence of a secret tunnel the NSA had dug beneath the Soviet embassy in Washington, the identities of Soviet officials who had been secretly cooperating with the US, and details of American nuclear war planning. The tunnel project alone had cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Here's the part that lingers, though. Despite years of behavior that raised internal questions, Hansen was never once polygraphed during his entire FBI career. Standard procedure existed. It simply wasn't applied to him. He was finally caught not through internal vigilance, but by purchasing his own KGB file from a Russian source. 23. The trial that divided a generation. Few espionage cases in American history generated as much public emotion as the prosecution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And here's the thing. The two cases were not nearly as equivalent as they were treated at the time. Julius Rosenberg was confirmed as a Soviet intelligence asset by the Venona decryption program. The cables were clear, and his role in passing atomic secrets was genuine. Ethel's case was considerably murkier. The primary testimony against her came from her own brother, David Greenglass, who decades later admitted he had given false or exaggerated testimony about her involvement in order to protect his own wife from prosecution. Both Julius and Ethel were convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage and executed in June of 1953. The question of what Ethel actually knew and whether the evidence against her met the standard required for a death sentence has been debated by historians ever since. Some questions don't get cleaner with time. 24. The man at the center of everything. Here's the thing about Kim Philby. For years, he was exactly where you'd want your most trusted ally to be, which made him extraordinarily useful to the people he was actually working for. Philby was a senior British intelligence officer who served as the principal liaison between British intelligence and both the CIA and FBI, during the early Cold War. And he attended meetings, he reviewed files, he knew names, and for the entire time he held that position, he was one of the Soviet Union's most valuable intelligence assets, a member of the so-called Cambridge 5 spy ring recruited during his university years. Operations were compromised. Western agents died. Both the CIA and MI6 had at various points suspected him. Both had been reassured by his colleagues and his manner. Philby defected to Moscow in 1963. He lived there comfortably until his death in 1988, decades after the damage had been done. 25. The name that wasn't supposed to be printed. Valerie Plame had spent years building a career as a covert CIA officer, the kind of work that depends, above all else, on anonymity. Here's the thing that happened in 2003. Her identity was leaked to the press by officials within the George W. Bush administration. Her husband, former Ambassador Joseph Wilson, had publicly contradicted the administration's claims about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, writing an op-ed that directly challenged the intelligence being used to justify the Iraq War. Shortly after, Plame's name appeared in a nationally syndicated column. A special prosecutor was appointed to investigate the disclosure. Vice presidential aide Scooter Libby was ultimately convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice in connection with the investigation. President Bush commuted his sentence before he served a single day in prison. Plame's covert career ended the day her name was published. Her network of contacts faced risk that took years to quietly assess. 26. The tech companies and the quiet court orders. Most people who used the internet in the early 2010s had a reasonable assumption about their data, that it belonged to them, or at least that a company wouldn't simply hand it over without a fight. Here's the thing about PRISM, COINTELPRO, which was revealed in the summer of 2013 by former NSA contractor Edward Snowden. PRISM was a surveillance program that collected internet communications data directly from major U.S. technology companies, among them Google, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. The companies were not volunteering the information. They were complying with classified court orders issued under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, orders they were legally prohibited from publicly disclosing. Most of the company's users had no idea the program existed. Most of the companies had never publicly acknowledged it. The Snowden documents changed that. Whether the program was legal, proportionate, or necessary has been argued in courts and congressional hearings ever since. 27. The surveillance program that skipped Congress. There is a process in American government for authorizing things that are unusual. It involves telling Congress, getting approval, and operating within established legal boundaries. Here's the thing about Stellar Wind. It skipped most of that. In the days immediately following September 11th, 2001, President George W. Bush authorized a warrantless surveillance program that allowed the NSA to monitor American phone calls and emails without obtaining the court orders normally required by law. Congressional leadership was briefed in a highly limited way. The broader Congress was not informed. The program operated in classified secrecy for years before portions of it were revealed through investigative journalism in 2005. It was eventually restructured under amended FISA legislation. In 2020, a federal appeals court ruled that the warrantless collection portion of the original program had been illegal. It had been running for years before that ruling arrived. 28. The building that holds everything. There is a data center in Bluffdale, Utah that most Americans have never thought about, and here's the thing. It is very, very large. The NSA's Intelligence Community Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative data center opened in 2013 and was built specifically to store intercepted communications at a scale that older facilities simply couldn't handle. The building contains 5 data halls, each one roughly the size of 2 football fields. The theoretical storage capacity has been described in terms of yottabytes, a unit of data so large that articulating what it actually represents takes longer than most people want to sit with. The facility's existence became widely known through the Snowden disclosures. Its precise capabilities remain classified. What it suggests, sitting out there quietly in the Utah desert, is that the volume of information being collected had grown so large that an entirely new kind of building was needed just to hold it. 29. The writer who was right about being watched, Ernest Hemingway, spent the final years of his life convinced he was under federal surveillance. He told friends about it. He mentioned it to his doctors. The people around him, with some understandable concern, interpreted this as a symptom of mental deterioration, paranoia presenting as a fixed belief without apparent basis. Here's the thing, though. After Hemingway's death in 1961, researchers filed Freedom of Information Act requests for any files the FBI might have maintained on him. The files existed. The FBI had been monitoring Hemingway since 1942 during World War II, when he operated a network of anti-Nazi informants in Cuba with the approval of the American ambassador. Surveillance had continued in various forms for years after. Hemingway had not been imagining things. His doctors had treated his accurate perception of reality as a symptom of illness. That particular detail has a way of staying with you. 30. The Chancellor's phone. Here's the thing about the relationship between allied nations. It is built, at least officially, on a foundation of mutual trust, shared intelligence, and the understanding that certain lines simply aren't crossed. In 2013, documents released through Edward Snowden revealed that the NSA had been intercepting the personal mobile phone communications of German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Not a suspected adversary, not a foreign national of concern. The sitting leader of one of America's closest allies. The interception had reportedly been occurring for years before anyone told the White House it was happening, or at least that was the version offered publicly. President Obama reportedly called Merkel personally to apologize. The revelation strained diplomatic relations for months. Germany launched its own formal investigation. The broader disclosure that Allied leaders had been routinely monitored produced a very specific kind of diplomatic awkwardness that no prepared talking point could quite smooth over. 31. The network built on laundry lines. It's easy to imagine Revolutionary War spying as a dramatic affair. Secret meetings, whispered codes, candlelit maps. And sometimes it was. But here's the thing about the everyday mechanics of the Culper Ring. Much of it was almost mundanely domestic. One of the network's key signals involved a woman named Anna Strong, whose clothesline on Long Island reportedly served as a communication tool. The arrangement of black petticoats and white handkerchiefs indicated where and when messages could be retrieved by other members of the network. The genius of the system was its invisibility. Laundry hanging on a line was not suspicious. It was ordinary. In an era before telegraph or telephone, the most effective intelligence network in North America was, in part, being run through a perfectly normal clothesline in a perfectly normal yard. George Washington's spy ring worked precisely because it looked like it wasn't working at all. 32. The invisible ink that changed the war. Continuing from where we just were, here's the thing about the actual tools the Culper Ring used. They were more sophisticated than you might expect from an 18th century operation. The invisible ink used by Washington's network wasn't a simple lemon juice trick. It was a chemical formula developed by Sir James Jay, a physician and the brother of founding father John Jay. The formula required a specific reagent to reveal the hidden writing, meaning intercepted letters were essentially unreadable without the matching chemical. Operatives would write ordinary letters on top of the invisible text. Civilian correspondence that could be explained away if discovered. The combination of layered communication, chemical concealment, and a cover story built into every message made the system remarkably resilient. Washington personally managed much of the correspondence with his agents. For a man running a war, he spent a great deal of careful time on the letters that were never supposed to be read. 33. The double agent at Yorktown James Fayette's story is worth returning to, because the specifics of what he actually accomplished deserve more than a passing mention. Here's the thing about double agent work in any era. The psychological endurance required is extraordinary. Fayette moved freely within British military command, gathering information about troop movements, supply lines, and strategic intentions while appearing entirely loyal to the British cause. The intelligence he passed to Lafayette is credited with contributing meaningfully to the American strategy at Yorktown, the battle that effectively ended the Revolutionary War. He was doing this as an enslaved man, with no legal standing, no guaranteed protection, and no formal recognition waiting on the other side. When the war ended, he returned to slavery because the legal structures of the new nation he had helped create did not yet include him. His freedom came 4 years later, through a petition written by a French general who had not forgotten what Fayette had risked. 34. The OSS chef who kept her cover for decades. Julia Child has been discussed in culinary circles for generations. And here's the thing. For a long time, the OSS chapter of her life was known mostly to people who went looking for it. Child joined the Office of Strategic Services in 1942 at the age of 30. She was tall, 6 feet 2 inches, energetic, and possessed of an organizational precision that served her well in the research and development branch. She processed documents, helped coordinate information, and worked in multiple postings, including Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and China. She met her husband Paul Child while they were both serving with the OSS. The two of them built a life together that eventually led to Paris, cooking school, and the television career that made her famous. She didn't talk about her intelligence work much during her lifetime, not out of secrecy exactly, but because that part of her life had simply become another chapter in a very full story. 35. The 17-year wait for Venona. The Venona program is one of those intelligence achievements whose significance only becomes fully visible in retrospect. And here's the thing. The people doing the work had no idea if it would ever amount to anything. The NSA's codebreakers began working on Soviet intelligence intercepts in 1943. The cables they were trying to decrypt had been sent during the 1940s and used a theoretically unbreakable one-time pad cipher system. The Soviets, however, had made an operational error, reusing some of the key material due to wartime production pressures. That reuse created a mathematical crack that American analysts spent years widening. By the time meaningful decryptions were achieved, some of the events described in the cables were already years in the past. Agents had come and gone. Damage had been done. The program ran until 1980, and its existence wasn't disclosed to the public until 1995, more than 50 years after the first intercept was made. 36. The director's long shadow. Alan Dulles had a remarkable talent for institutional survival, which makes the arc of his career worth sitting with for a moment. Here's the thing about the 8 years he ran the CIA. The operations launched under his tenure didn't just shape individual countries. They shaped what the CIA understood itself to be capable of doing. The overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran, the removal of Arbenz in Guatemala. These weren't fringe activities. They were the centerpiece achievements of his directorship, held up internally as proof of what covert action could accomplish quickly and cheaply. The long-term consequences were, as later decades would demonstrate, considerably more expensive than the initial operations. Dulles was fired after the Bay of Pigs in 1961 and replaced by John McCone. But the culture he built, the sense that the CIA could and should shape foreign governments when necessary, persisted long after he left the building. 37. The man who trusted no one. James Angleton's story gets stranger the longer you sit with it. And here's the thing. The tragedy of his career isn't simply that he was wrong. It's that his wrongness was indistinguishable from the inside from being right. Counterintelligence work is by nature paranoid. Its entire function is to assume that enemies are hiding in plain sight. Angleton took that assumption and applied it without apparent limit. He was deeply influenced by a Soviet defector named Anatoly Golitsyn, who claimed the CIA was thoroughly penetrated by Moscow. Angleton believed him, perhaps more completely than the evidence warranted. Officers with any connection to Soviet affairs became suspects. Careers were ended. The Soviet division of the CIA was, by multiple accounts, effectively paralyzed for years. When Angleton was eventually pushed out, the Soviet spy he had spent 2 decades hunting had not been found. Aldrich Ames, the actual mole who would be caught years later, had not yet even been recruited. 38. The finding that stays locked away. Presidential findings, the written authorizations that must precede every covert operation, represent one of the more quietly significant features of American intelligence oversight. Here's the thing about the files themselves, though. Knowing they exist and being able to read them are entirely different things. Findings are drafted by the CIA, reviewed by the National Security Council, and signed by the President. They describe the operation, its purpose, and its legal basis. They create a paper record of executive accountability. In practice, they are classified at levels that place them beyond the reach of Freedom of Information Act requests, congressional staffers without specific clearances, and virtually every external oversight mechanism, short of a formal investigation. Historians studying covert operations often have to reconstruct what was authorized from secondary sources, participant memoirs, leaked documents, and congressional testimony, because the primary documents remain sealed. The accountability is structural. The scrutiny is not. 39. What the Church Committee actually found. Most people have a vague sense that the Church Committee uncovered troubling things, but here's the thing. The specific details are worth naming carefully because they aren't vague at all. The committee documented CIA assassination plots targeting foreign leaders including Fidel Castro, Patrice Lumumba of the Congo, and others. It exposed Operation Chaos and COINTELPRO simultaneously, demonstrating that both the CIA and FBI had been conducting unauthorized domestic surveillance of American citizens for years. It revealed MKUltra. It found that the NSA had been intercepting telegrams of American citizens without warrants. And it documented the FBI's campaign against Martin Luther King Jr. in detail that was genuinely disturbing to the senators conducting the investigation. Senator Frank Church, the committee's chairman, described the intelligence community as a potential rogue elephant. The metaphor was contested. The underlying findings were not. 40. The reforms that didn't quite hold. The Church Committee's work led to a series of genuine structural reforms in the mid-1970s. And here's the thing about what happened to those reforms over the following decades. Some held, some evolved, and some were substantially dismantled. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 created a special court to oversee domestic intelligence surveillance, a meaningful check on warrantless monitoring. Intelligence oversight committees were established in both chambers of Congress. Executive orders were issued banning assassination plots against foreign leaders. For roughly 2 decades, this framework shaped how American intelligence operated. Then, after September 11, 2001, the legal landscape shifted considerably. The Patriot Act expanded surveillance authorities. Programs like Stellar Wind operated outside the established framework entirely. The FISA court was asked to authorize surveillance at a scale it had never been designed to accommodate. The architecture of oversight built in the 1970s was still technically standing. Parts of it, though, had quietly changed shape. 40 facts in, and if you've made it this far, something is worth acknowledging. You've covered nearly half a century of American intelligence history, and your eyes are probably doing that slow, pleasant thing where they're not quite open anymore. That's fine. That's the whole point. The stories aren't going anywhere. Neither are you. Settle in a little deeper and let's keep going. 41. The spy who came in from the Cold War closet intelligence history has a way of revealing itself in layers. And here's the thing about the years immediately following the Church Committee. The reforms created a new kind of pressure inside the CIA. Officers who had spent careers operating in a culture of minimal oversight now found themselves working under congressional scrutiny, legal frameworks, and formal accountability structures that hadn't existed before. Some adapted, some retired. Some, like Aldrich Ames, were still decades away from being caught. The institutional adjustment was real but uneven. Certain habits, the tendency to classify broadly, to report selectively upward, to treat oversight as an obstacle rather than a function, didn't disappear because a Senate committee had documented them. They went quieter. The Church Committee had opened the files. What it couldn't fully do was change the culture that had generated those files in the first place. Culture in large institutions moves considerably slower than legislation. 42. The spy ring that used number stations, long before encrypted messaging apps and secure digital channels, intelligence agencies communicated with field agents through one of the stranger technologies of the 20th century, shortwave radio broadcasts of seemingly random numbers. Here's the thing about number stations. They were real, they were widespread, and most people who stumbled across them on the radio dial had absolutely no idea what they were hearing. A voice, sometimes a child's voice, sometimes a woman reading in a flat, unhurried tone, would broadcast strings of numbers on repeat at scheduled intervals. The agent in the field, with the right one-time pad, could decode the message. No transmission back was required. No signal could be traced to the receiver. The broadcaster could never be proven to be communicating with anyone specific. Number stations operated across the Cold War era and beyond. Some continued broadcasting well into the 2000s. A few appear to still be active. Nobody officially acknowledges running them. 43. The Cambridge Five and the damage they did. Kim Philby was the most famous member of a spy ring. And here's the thing about the broader group he belonged to. The full scope of what the Cambridge Five compromised took decades to properly calculate. The Five, Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald McLean, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross were all recruited to Soviet intelligence during their time at Cambridge University in the 1930s. They then dispersed into British government, intelligence services, and diplomatic postings, spending the following decades in positions of genuine access and influence. Burgess and McLean defected to Moscow in 1951. Philby followed in 1963. Blunt was quietly confronted by British intelligence in 1964, granted immunity in exchange for a confession, and his involvement wasn't publicly acknowledged until 1979. Cairncross confessed in 1991. Between them, the five had access to Allied war planning, atomic research, and Cold War strategy for a combined span of decades. 44. The agent who recruited herself. Most Cold War espionage stories follow a recognizable shape. A foreign intelligence service identifies a target, develops a relationship over time, and eventually makes a recruitment pitch. Here's the thing about Virginia Hall, though. Her story doesn't follow that shape at all. Hall was an American woman who, despite losing her left leg below the knee in a hunting accident that ended her hopes of a diplomatic career, became one of the most effective Allied intelligence operatives of World War II. She worked first for British Special Operations and later for the OSS, running agent networks in occupied France, while the Gestapo actively hunted her. The Gestapo reportedly circulated her description and referred to her as the most dangerous of all Allied spies. She operated under multiple aliases, disguised herself variously as a French milkmaid and an elderly peasant woman, and once escaped into Spain by crossing the Pyrenees Mountains on foot in winter. After the war, she joined the CIA and worked there until her retirement in 1966. 45. The defector who changed everything. Twice. Defectors are among the most complicated figures in intelligence history, and here's the thing about Oleg Penkovsky. His story illustrates just how much a single well-placed source can matter. Penkovsky was a colonel in Soviet military intelligence who, in 1961, approached Western intelligence on his own initiative and offered to share everything he knew. Over roughly 18 months, he passed thousands of photographs of Soviet military documents to CIA and MI6 handlers. Among the intelligence he provided was detailed information about Soviet missile capabilities, information that proved directly relevant during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when American analysts used his materials to assess the actual state of Soviet nuclear readiness. Penkovsky was arrested by Soviet security services in 1962, tried for treason, and executed in 1963. The intelligence he passed during those 18 months is considered by historians among the most significant single-source contributions of the entire Cold War. 46. The listening post nobody talked about. Here's the thing about the geography of intelligence collection during the Cold War. The closer you could get to the source, the better the signal. Which is why the CIA and NSA operated a network of listening posts in countries bordering the Soviet Union, some of which remained classified for decades after the Cold War ended. One of the more remarkable was a facility operated in cooperation with the Iranian government under the Shah, a relationship that worked until the Iranian Revolution of 1979, when American intelligence lost access to some of its most valuable collection positions almost overnight. So, the loss of those posts created a significant gap in American knowledge about Soviet missile tests and military communications that took years to partially reconstruct through satellite and other technical means. The revolution that cost the CIA its Iranian listening stations was, at least in part, a consequence of the same 1953 coup the CIA had organized. The connection between those two events is one that American intelligence historians return to regularly. 47. The poison umbrella and the art of deniability. Here's the thing about Cold War assassination techniques. They were designed not just to be effective, but to be deniable. The case of Georgi Markov is perhaps the most vividly documented example. Markov was a Bulgarian dissident living in London who was killed in 1978 when a modified umbrella was used to inject a tiny pellet containing ricin into his leg while he waited at a bus stop on Waterloo Bridge. He died 3 days later. British authorities confirmed the pellet and the ricin. Soviet and Bulgarian intelligence involvement was strongly suspected, but never formally proven during the Cold War. The case became a landmark in the history of state-sponsored assassination, both for its technical ingenuity and for the way it illustrated how a foreign government could reach across borders and eliminate a critic while maintaining plausible distance. The full extent of Soviet-era assassination programs targeting dissidents abroad took decades of archival work to begin documenting. 48. The submarine that sank and the secret. It held project. Azorian's recovery of a Soviet submarine in 1974 is a well-documented operation. But here's the thing about what actually drove the effort. It was less about the physical hardware than about the information potentially stored inside it. The submarine in question, K-129, had sunk in the Pacific in 1968, under circumstances the Soviet Navy never publicly explained. American intelligence believed the vessel might contain nuclear missiles, torpedo designs, cryptographic equipment, and signal code books that would provide extraordinary insight into Soviet naval capabilities. The CIA authorized the construction of an entirely custom-built recovery vessel, the Glomar Explorer, at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. The cover story involving Howard Hughes was genuinely convincing. When the vessel finally attempted recovery 6 years after the submarine sank, the hull broke apart before the full recovery could be completed. What was retrieved was valuable. What slipped back to the ocean floor remained there. 49. The spy who hid in plain sight for 30 years. There is a particular quality to the Robert Hansen story that makes it linger. And here's the thing that gets to the center of it. Hansen wasn't a glamorous figure. He wasn't charming or internationally mobile in the way Cold War spy fiction tends to suggest. He was, by most accounts, an intensely private, somewhat difficult man who attended daily mass, homeschooled his children, and worked in a nondescript government building in Washington. He passed information to the Soviets and later the Russians through dead drops, physical exchanges of packages left in parks and under bridges, because he refused to ever meet his handlers in person. That refusal, he later explained, was a security measure. He was careful in his tradecraft, even as he was careless about everything else. His FBI colleagues found him abrasive. Some found him brilliant. Nobody apparently found the inconsistencies suspicious enough to act on for 22 years to 50. The code name that became a lawsuit. Valerie Plame's case had a legal afterlife that most people don't follow all the way through. And here's the thing about what it revealed about the limits of accountability in intelligence-related prosecutions. After Scooter Libby's conviction for perjury and obstruction, Plame and her husband Joseph Wilson filed a civil lawsuit against Vice President Dick Cheney, Libby, and others, twice alleging the disclosure of her identity had violated their constitutional rights. The lawsuit was dismissed in 2007 on procedural grounds. The court ruled that the officials had been acting within the scope of their duties and were therefore protected. The underlying question of who had first leaked her name to the press and with what intent was never resolved through the legal system to the satisfaction of everyone involved. Richard Armitage, a State Department official, Charles was later identified as the initial source of the leak. The case closed without producing the kind of definitive accountability that many observers had expected from a special prosecutor investigation, lasting nearly 3 years. 51. The satellite that saw everything. Spy satellites are one of those technologies that everyone knows exist in a general sense, and almost nobody knows the specifics of. And here's the thing about the earliest American reconnaissance satellite program. It was significantly more advanced, significantly earlier, than the public record suggested for decades. The Corona program, which ran from 1959 to 1972, produced photographic intelligence of Soviet territory that transformed American understanding of the military balance during the Cold War. The satellites used a film return system. Exposed film canisters were ejected from orbit and recovered by aircraft over the Pacific Ocean as they parachuted down. Early Corona missions returned images of more Soviet territory in a single pass than all previous U.S. aerial reconnaissance combined. The program was officially declassified in 1995. Before that, the satellites had been flying over the Soviet Union for 36 years, while their existence was acknowledged only in the vaguest terms. And if you've made it exactly halfway through this quiet history, 51 facts down, 50 to go, now is a good time to hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Every episode goes somewhere unexpected. This one still has a long, fascinating way to go. 52. The Honey Trap and the Cold War Playbook. There is an entire category of Cold War intelligence operation that both sides understood perfectly well and rarely discussed publicly. And here's the thing about what the East Germans called the Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung. Their foreign intelligence service ran one of the most systematically effective seduction-based recruitment programs of the Cold War era. Male and female agents, known informally as Romeo and Juliet spies, were trained to develop genuine romantic relationships with Western government secretaries, officials, and military personnel who had access to classified information. The relationships sometimes lasted years. Targets often had no idea they were being run as intelligence assets. When the East German archives were opened after reunification in 1990, West German investigators found hundreds of cases. Some targets had passed information for years while genuinely believing they were in a private relationship. The program was considered by Western intelligence professionals to be among the most cost-effective collection methods of the entire Cold War. 53. The newspaper that printed the Pentagon Papers. Here's the thing about the publication of the Pentagon Papers in 1971. It was, in terms of its immediate legal drama, one of the most compressed crises in American press history. Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst who had worked on a classified Defense Department study of U.S. decision-making in Vietnam, leaked the study to the New York Times and Washington Post after years of internal frustration. The Nixon administration sought a court injunction to stop publication, prior restraint in First Amendment terms. The case went from a district court to the Supreme Court in 15 days. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 against the government. The papers were published. They revealed that multiple administrations had systematically misled Congress and the public about the scope, costs, and prospects of the Vietnam War. The classification system had been used not to protect national security, but to protect the government from its own documented decision-making. Ellsberg was charged under the Espionage Act. The charges were eventually dismissed. 54. The tunnel beneath the embassy. The NSA tunnel beneath the Soviet embassy in Washington, the one Robert Hansen eventually revealed to Moscow, was an extraordinary piece of infrastructure. And here's the thing about how it came to exist. The tunnel was designed to intercept communications traveling through underground cables connected to the Soviet embassy on Wisconsin Avenue. Building it required years of planning, careful engineering to avoid detection, and the kind of institutional patience that large covert programs demand. The project reportedly cost hundreds of millions of dollars. It became operational sometime in the 1980s. Hansen revealed its existence to his Soviet handlers, meaning that for some portion of its operational life, the Soviets were aware the tunnel existed and could manage what signals passed through the compromised cables accordingly. Whether they fully exploited that knowledge, and for how long, remains partially classified. What is documented is that by the time American investigators figured out Hansen had told them, the tunnel's intelligence value had been significantly diminished. 55. The Ghost Plane and the Rendition Program. Here's the thing about extraordinary rendition. As a policy, it existed in various forms for decades, but it became significantly more systematic after September 11, 2001. The program involved the transfer of individuals suspected of terrorism to third countries for detention and interrogation, sometimes using aircraft that had been registered under shell companies to conceal their government connections. Aviation enthusiasts and investigative journalists tracking tail numbers eventually identified a fleet of aircraft used in these transfers, planes that moved through civilian airports without the usual diplomatic documentation, operated by private contractors working for American intelligence. The European Parliament conducted an investigation and estimated that over 1,000 flights had passed through European airspace. Several European governments were found to have cooperated with the program without informing their own parliaments. The Senate Intelligence Committee's report on detention and interrogation, released in summary form in 2014, documented conditions at detention sites in considerable detail. 56. The analyst who wouldn't sign off. There is a specific kind of institutional courage that comes from saying, inside a bureaucracy, that the evidence doesn't support the conclusion being drawn. And here's the thing about the period leading up to the Iraq War in 2002 and 2003, that courage was in shorter supply than it should have been. Multiple CIA analysts later described an environment in which intelligence assessments were shaped by the conclusions policymakers wanted to reach, rather than by what the underlying evidence actually showed. The October 2002 National Intelligence Estimate on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction included dissenting views from the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, which assessed the aluminum tubes cited as evidence of a nuclear program as likely intended for conventional rockets. That dissent was in the document. It was not prominently featured in public presentations of the intelligence case for war. The Senate Intelligence Committee's subsequent review found significant failures in the analytical process. 57. The night the lights went out in Tehran. Here's the thing about the 1953 coup in Iran. The timeline of events in those final days was genuinely chaotic in a way that retrospective accounts sometimes smooth over. The first attempt to remove Mossadegh on August 15th failed when military officers lost their nerve and the plot was exposed. The Shah fled the country. For roughly 3 days, it appeared the operation had collapsed entirely. CUA officer Kermit Roosevelt Jr., who was running the operation on the ground in Tehran, reportedly stayed in the country and worked to reorganize a second attempt rather than evacuate. Street demonstrations were paid for and organized. Newspaper coverage was purchased. On August 19th, the second attempt succeeded. The Shah returned. Mossadegh was arrested, tried, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. Roosevelt returned to Washington. He was reportedly offered a senior position with the company that had most directly benefited from the operation, United Fruit's Iranian oil equivalent, Anglo-Persian. He declined. 58. The encryption machine that wasn't secure. Here's the thing about Crypto AG. For decades, it was the world's leading supplier of encryption machines to foreign governments, trusted by embassies and military commands around the world to protect their most sensitive communications. What those governments didn't know was that the company had been secretly owned in varying arrangements by the CIA and West German intelligence since the early Cold War era. The machines sold to foreign customers, over 100 governments at various points, had been deliberately engineered with backdoors that allowed American and German intelligence to read the encrypted traffic as easily as if it had been sent in plain text. The operation, codenamed Theseus and later Rubicon, ran for decades. Foreign governments paid for machines they believed were protecting their secrets. They were, in effect, paying to hand their secrets to the CIA. The Washington Post revealed the operation's full scope in 2020 based on classified documents. Crypto AG had dissolved in 2018. 59. The whistleblower before Snowden, Edward Snowden, is the name most commonly associated with NSA disclosures. But here's the thing about Thomas Drake. His case established much of the legal and institutional context that shaped how the government would later respond to Snowden. Drake was a senior NSA executive who, in the mid-2000s, raised concerns through official channels about a surveillance program he believed was wasteful, ineffective, and legally problematic. When internal complaints and congressional notifications produced no meaningful response, he eventually provided unclassified information to a journalist. He was charged under the Espionage Act in 2010, facing 35 years in prison. The government's case collapsed in 2011 when a federal judge questioned the prosecution's legal theory. Drake pleaded to a minor misdemeanor and was sentenced to community service. So, his case illustrated how the Espionage Act, written in 1917, was being applied to government employees who disclosed information to journalists rather than to foreign powers. 60. The documents that almost didn't survive. The story of how MKUltra became fully known to the public is, in its own way, a story about the fragility of accountability. And here's the thing about what happened in 1973. CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files before he left office. The order was carried out. Approximately 80% of the program's records were eliminated. What saved any part of the documentary record was essentially an accident of bureaucratic geography. A separate cache of approximately 20,000 documents had been misfiled in a financial records building rather than stored with the main program files. That building wasn't searched during the initial destruction order. When a FOIA request prompted a more thorough record search in 1977, the misfiled documents were found. They became the primary source for the Senate subcommittee hearings that followed. What survived was enough to confirm the program's scope and methods. What was destroyed, 80% of the record, remains permanently gone. We're 60 facts into this quiet history, and the night has gotten a little deeper around you. If your thoughts are starting to drift a little, following a thread and then losing it softly somewhere in the middle, that's exactly right. You don't need to hold on to every detail. The stories are here. They'll keep. Let your mind go a little slower now. 61. The spy satellite with a parachute. There is something almost poetic about the earliest American spy satellites. And here's the thing about the Corona program's film recovery system. It required a level of engineering precision that still impresses people who study it today. Once a Corona satellite had finished photographing Soviet territory from orbit, it ejected a re-entry capsule containing the exposed film. That capsule re-entered the atmosphere, deployed a parachute, and fell toward the Pacific Ocean. Specially equipped aircraft, C-19s and later C-13s, would fly through the recovery zone trailing hooks, designed to catch the parachute midair before the capsule hit the water. The window for a successful catch was extremely narrow. If the aircraft missed, the capsule was designed to float for a limited time before sinking, to prevent Soviet recovery. Early missions failed repeatedly before the technique was mastered. Eventually, the system became reliable enough that single satellite passes were returning more photographic intelligence than years of previous aerial reconnaissance combined. The whole operation looked from a distance like a strange kind of fishing. 62. The mole who wasn't there. James Angleton's long search for a Soviet mole inside the CIA is a story that rewards careful attention. And here's the thing about its strangest chapter. The defector who drove much of Angleton's paranoia was himself considered suspect by other Western intelligence services. Anatoly Golitsyn, the Soviet defector whose claims about deep CIA penetration Angleton found so convincing, was assessed by several British and French intelligence analysts as either genuinely mistaken or, in some readings, a deliberately placed source designed to sow institutional confusion. A second Soviet defector, Yuri Nosenko, arrived in 1964 and directly contradicted several of Golitsyn's claims. Angleton concluded Nosenko was a plant and had him confined and subjected to prolonged hostile interrogation for nearly 4 years. Later assessments suggested Nosenko had been genuine. The CIA had imprisoned a legitimate defector, while the man who had convinced them to do so was of uncertain reliability. Angleton's certainty had become a problem that looked, from the outside, exactly like the penetration he feared. 63. The radio broadcast that started a war scare. Here's the thing about psychological operations. Their effectiveness depends entirely on the target audience having no idea they're being conducted. During the early Cold War, the CIA funded and operated Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, broadcasting into Soviet bloc countries with news and programming designed to counter Soviet state media. The stations were presented publicly as independent, listener-supported broadcasts. Their CIA funding was not disclosed. The arrangement was eventually revealed in the late 1960s through investigative reporting, creating a significant credibility problem for the stations. After the disclosure, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were restructured and placed under congressional oversight. They continued broadcasting. Here's the quietly remarkable part. Decades later, after the Soviet Union collapsed, surveys of Eastern European populations consistently found that Radio Free Europe had been among the most trusted news sources available to people living under Soviet-era information control. The deception about funding had undermined the station's credibility in the West. Inside the bloc, the programming itself had built something genuine. 64. The analyst in the bicycle intelligence analysis is often imagined as a high-tech affair. Satellites, intercepts, elaborate databases. And here's the thing about how it actually worked at the ground level during much of the Cold War. A significant portion of early CIA analysis relied on what officers called open-source intelligence, newspapers, academic journals, radio broadcasts, and public government statements from target countries. Before satellite imagery became routine, analysts would study photographs published in Soviet newspapers, examining backgrounds for military equipment, measuring shadows to estimate the height of structures, and tracking the careers of officials through changes in their placement at public events. One well-documented example, analysts tracking Soviet military developments used publicly released May Day parade footage and photographs to assess the capabilities and production rates of Soviet military hardware. The footage was shown every year. The analysts watched every frame. The most sophisticated intelligence operation in the world was, some days, essentially watching the news very carefully. 65. The night the Bay of Pigs failed. The Bay of Pigs invasion of April 1961 is one of those historical events whose failure was overdetermined. And here's the thing about the specific mechanics of how it unraveled. Almost nothing went as planned, starting from the first hours. The operation involved approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles trained by the CIA who were to land on Cuba's southern coast, establish a beachhead, and trigger a popular uprising against Fidel Castro. The airstrikes designed to destroy the Cuban Air Force before the landing were scaled back by the Kennedy administration, leaving Castro with functioning aircraft. The landing site had been changed from Trinidad, which had better escape routes, to the Bay of Pigs, which didn't. Intelligence assessments had overestimated popular support for the invasion. Within 72 hours, the invasion force had been surrounded and captured. Over 1,000 men were taken prisoner. They were eventually ransomed back to the United States in exchange for approximately $53 million in food and medicine. Kennedy accepted public responsibility. He privately told associates he wanted to break the CIA into pieces. 66. The Secret Army in Laos. Here's the thing about the CIA's involvement in Laos during the Vietnam War era. It constitutes one of the largest covert paramilitary operations in the agency's history, and for years, almost none of it was publicly known. Beginning in the early 1960s, the CIA organized, trained, funded, and effectively commanded a secret army in Laos composed primarily of Hmong fighters, led by General Vang Pao. The operation, Daos, conducted under the designation of various cover programs, involved tens of thousands of fighters at its peak and ran for roughly a decade. It was a war being fought simultaneously with the Vietnam War in a neighboring country by an intelligence agency operating largely outside formal military command structures. Congress was given limited briefings. The American public knew almost nothing. When the operation eventually collapsed in 1975 following the fall of Saigon, many of the Hmong fighters and their families faced severe reprisals. Tens of thousands eventually resettled in the United States as refugees. 67. The telephone that wasn't safe. Here's the thing about the secure telephone units used by American government officials throughout much of the Cold War. The security they provided was at various points considerably less complete than their users believed. The challenge of building genuinely secure voice communications is significant. Every component in the chain, from the handset to the transmission line to the exchange, represents a potential vulnerability. Soviet technical intelligence operations targeted American communications infrastructure persistently throughout the Cold War era, looking for points of access. The Walker spy ring, John Walker, a Navy communications officer who sold cryptographic secrets to the Soviets from 1968 to 1985, gave Soviet intelligence the ability to decrypt a significant volume of American naval communications for nearly 2 decades. Walker recruited his brother, his son, and a friend into the ring. The damage was assessed as among the most serious communications security breaches in American military history. He was arrested in 1985. The same year, Aldrich Ames began his own betrayal. 68. The fake rock in Moscow. During the Cold War and well into the post-Soviet era, intelligence agencies on both sides used physical dead drops, hidden locations where materials could be left and retrieved without the parties ever meeting. Here's the thing about one particularly well-documented example. In 2006, Russian Federal Security Service officers publicly accused British intelligence of using a hollow artificial rock planted in a Moscow park as a dead drop for transferring information and funds to Russian intelligence assets. The British government initially declined to comment. Several years later, a former British cabinet minister confirmed the operation had been real. The rock had apparently been functioning as a concealed data transfer point, with agents able to download information from it using handheld devices as they walked past. It was, in miniature, a perfect example of how Cold War tradecraft had adapted to digital technology. The same basic concept of a concealed container in a public location, updated with electronics small enough to fit inside a decorative stone. 69. The satellite that changed arms control. Here's the thing about what reconnaissance satellites actually made possible. Beyond intelligence collection, they changed the fundamental nature of arms control verification. Before reliable overhead imagery, any treaty limiting nuclear weapons faced an obvious problem. How do you verify that the other side is actually complying? On-site inspections were politically unacceptable to the Soviet Union for much of the Cold War. The solution, which emerged gradually through the Corona program and its successors, was national technical means of verification, a diplomatic phrase meaning essentially spy satellites. The SALT arms control agreements of the 1970s included provisions explicitly acknowledging that each side would use national technical means to verify the other's compliance, and that neither side would interfere with the other's reconnaissance satellites. Spy satellites, in other words, became not just intelligence tools, but formal components of international treaty architecture. The arms race and the mechanism for managing it were both, in part, products of the same orbital technology. 70. The double agent who saved the world, maybe. Here's the thing about Oleg Gordievsky. His case is one of those where the word significant genuinely doesn't feel large enough. Gordievsky was a KGB officer who began secretly cooperating with British intelligence in the early 1974 and eventually rose to become the KGB's station chief in London, while simultaneously serving as MI6's most valuable source inside Soviet intelligence. During the extraordinarily tense period of 1983, when a NATO military exercise called Able Archer prompted genuine Soviet fears that the West was preparing a nuclear first strike. Gordievsky's reporting helped Western leaders understand how seriously Soviet leadership was taking the threat. That understanding contributed to adjustments in how subsequent exercises were conducted. Some historians argue his intelligence helped prevent a catastrophic miscalculation during one of the Cold War's most dangerous moments. He was extracted from Moscow in a dramatic car-based exfiltration operation in 1985, hidden under blankets in the back of a British diplomatic vehicle and brought safely to the West. 71. The listening station on the mountain geography has always mattered in intelligence collection. And here's the thing about the stations: the CIA and NSA operated in Turkey, Pakistan, and Iran during the Cold War. Their value was almost entirely a function of proximity. Signals weaken with distance. The closer a listening post was to a Soviet test site, missile installation, or military communication hub, the more clearly it could collect. The facility at Peshawar in Pakistan, for example, was positioned to monitor Soviet missile tests in Central Asia at ranges that would have been impossible from American territory. The U-2 spy plane flights, including the one that carried Francis Gary Powers when he was shot down in 1960, were staged partly from Peshawar. When the Shah of Iran was overthrown in 1979, the CIA lost 2 key listening stations in northern Iran that had been monitoring Soviet missile telemetry. The intelligence gap created by their loss took years to partially compensate for through other technical means and was never fully closed. 72. The spy plane everyone could see, coming Francis Gary Powers, and the U-2 incident of May 1960 are reasonably well known. But here's the thing about the broader U-2 program that often gets less attention. By the time Powers was shot down, American officials had known for years that the Soviets were aware the overflights were happening. The Soviets had been tracking the U-2 flights on radar since the program began in 1956. They simply didn't yet have a missile system that could reliably reach the plane's operating altitude of roughly 70,000 feet. When the SA-2 surface-to-air missile finally became capable of reaching that altitude, the flights became untenable. Powers was hit on his first operational flight after the new Soviet missile capability had become known to some within the American intelligence community. Eisenhower had approved the flight personally. When the Soviets announced they had shot down an American spy plane, the initial American cover story, that it was a weather research aircraft, collapsed when the Soviets produced both the plane and the surviving pilot. 73. The interrogation room and the question of methods. Here's the thing about the Senate Intelligence Committee's report on CIA detention and interrogation practices after September 11. Its release in summary form in December 2014 was itself a significant moment in the history of intelligence accountability. The report, which took 6 years to produce and ran to nearly 7,000 pages in classified form, examined the CIA's detention program and the interrogation methods used on detainees held at black sites, undisclosed facilities in multiple countries. The committee's summary found that some methods used were more severe than had been reported to congressional oversight committees, that the program produced less actionable intelligence than had been claimed, and that the CIA had, at times, provided inaccurate information to the White House and Congress about the program's effectiveness. The CIA disputed several of the report's findings. The full classified report has never been publicly released. The summary alone ran to nearly 500 pages. 74. The analyst who called the wall falling predicting major geopolitical events is one of intelligence analysis's hardest problems. And here's the thing about the CIA's record on the Soviet Union's collapse. It was, by the agency's own subsequent internal reviews, considerably less impressive than the institution's reputation might suggest. The CIA had large analytical resources devoted to the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. Its economic analyses of the Soviet system were, in retrospect, significantly off in ways that mattered. The scale of Soviet economic deterioration in the 1980s was underestimated. So, the political fragility of the system was underweighted in formal assessments. When the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, the event surprised most Western intelligence services. One CIA analyst, Milt Bearden, who was station chief in Pakistan at the time and had been deeply involved in the Afghan operation, later said the agency had been so focused on what the Soviets were doing abroad that it had insufficient attention on what was happening inside the country itself. 75. 3. The briefcase that crossed the border. Here's the thing about the mechanics of how Aldrich Ames actually passed information to his Soviet handlers. The tradecraft was, by professional standards, fairly unsophisticated, which made its success for 9 years all the more troubling to the CIA's subsequent internal review. Ames would prepare packages of classified documents, sometimes extremely sensitive materials identifying CIA assets and ongoing operations, and hand them directly to his Soviet contact at meetings in Washington restaurants and other locations. In the early phase of his espionage, he reportedly passed a grocery bag containing the identities of multiple CIA sources in a single handoff. He communicated through chalk marks on mailboxes and dead drops in parks. He spent his Soviet payments on home renovations, a Jaguar, and other expenses visible to anyone paying attention. The CIA's internal review after his arrest found systemic failures in financial monitoring of employees, a reluctance to flag lifestyle inconsistencies among senior officers, and a counterintelligence culture that had grown, in certain areas, dangerously comfortable. 76. Satser, the map that wasn't supposed to exist. Here's the thing about the intelligence assessments produced before the Iraq War. The story of how those assessments were developed, presented, and later re-examined represents one of the most thoroughly documented case studies in analytical failure in American intelligence history. The October 2002 National Intelligence Estimate concluded with high confidence that Iraq was reconstituting its nuclear weapons program and possessed chemical and biological weapons. Those conclusions were cited in public presentations by senior administration officials, including Secretary of State Colin Powell's February 2003 address to the United Nations Security Council. After the invasion and subsequent weapons search found no active weapons programs, multiple investigations by the Senate Intelligence Committee, the Rob Silberman Commission, and the British Butler Review examined how the assessments had gone wrong. The findings pointed to groupthink, pressure, and the collection of ambiguous signals that had been interpreted too uniformly in a single direction. 77. The defector's dilemma. Every defector who crosses from one side to the other brings with them an immediate credibility problem. And here's the thing about how intelligence services actually evaluate the people who walk in from the cold. The process is considerably more cautious and skeptical than popular culture tends to suggest. A defector might be exactly what they claim: a genuine source with valuable knowledge and legitimate reasons for switching sides. Or they might be a provocation, a deliberately placed source sent to feed false information, confirm existing beliefs, or identify Western intelligence methods and assets. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires extensive debriefing, cross-referencing with existing intelligence, polygraphs, and in some cases, years of careful evaluation. The CIA's handling of Soviet defectors during the Angleton era was particularly fraught. Angleton's conviction that Moscow was running sophisticated deception operations meant that genuine defectors sometimes faced years of hostile skepticism. Some defectors who were later assessed as legitimate had their most valuable intelligence discounted because it arrived during a period of maximum institutional suspicion. 78. The program that watched the watching. Here's the thing about the NSA's relationship with American technology companies in the decade following September 11th. It was more layered and more formally structured than most people understood before the Snowden disclosures. Beyond PRISM, which collected stored communications from technology company servers, the NSA also ran programs that operated at the infrastructure level, collecting data from the physical cables and switches through which internet traffic moved. A program called Upstream collected communications from internet backbone providers as data transited through their networks. Combined with PRISM's server-level collection, the two programs created overlapping coverage of a significant portion of global internet traffic. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, operating in secret, had authorized both programs. The court's opinions interpreting the legal authority for these programs ran to hundreds of pages, classified legal reasoning that shaped the scope of American surveillance law without any public knowledge that the interpretations existed. 79. Shah, the station chief who went public. Most CIA station chiefs spend their careers in careful anonymity. And here's the thing about what happened when that anonymity was stripped away in ways that went beyond the Plame case. The broader question of outing intelligence officers as a political tool had a legal history predating 2003. The Intelligence Identities Protection Act had been passed in 1982, specifically to criminalize the deliberate exposure of covert intelligence officers. The act had been championed by the intelligence community after a pattern of deliberate exposures in the 1970s by anti-COIA activists who published the names of CIA station chiefs in multiple countries. Philby, a former CIA officer, was among those who published such names. One of the officers identified, Richard Welch, was assassinated in Athens in 1975, shortly after his name appeared in a publication identifying CIA personnel. The act that resulted from that period was the same statute under which the Plame disclosure was initially investigated 28 years later. 80. The algorithm that reads the mail. Here's the thing about how modern signals intelligence actually works at scale. It doesn't involve a room full of analysts reading individual messages. It involves automated systems processing enormous volumes of communications data and flagging items that match criteria defined by analysts. Keywords, patterns, metadata, communication relationships, geographic filters. All of these function as automated selection tools applied to traffic volumes that no human team could manually review. The NSA's collection systems, as described in the Snowden documents, operated at a scale where the filtering and selection algorithms were themselves among the most sensitive classified elements of the programs. Knowing what the NSA's systems were looking for, what patterns triggered human review, would allow adversaries to structure their communications to avoid detection. The surveillance state that emerged after September 11th was not primarily a human operation. It was, by necessity, a computational one. The analysts were, in a sense, managing a system that was doing most of the actual work. 80 facts into this long, quiet evening. And if you've traveled this far through America's secret history, something has probably shifted in the room around you. The light is softer. Your thoughts are slower. The stories have been washing over you one after another, gentle as water. There's no need to hold on to all of it. Just let the next 20 carry you the rest of the way home. 81. The spy who came home in a trade Cold War prisoner exchanges have a cinematic quality to them that history mostly earns. And here's the thing about the exchange that returned Francis Gary Powers to the United States in 1962. It was one of the first formal spy swaps of the Cold War era and established a template that both sides would use for decades afterward. Powers had been held in Soviet custody for nearly 2 years following his capture after the U-2 shootdown. The exchange took place on the Glienicke Bridge connecting West Berlin to Potsdam, a location that would later become famous for exactly this kind of transaction. Powers was traded for Rudolf Abel, a Soviet intelligence officer who had been operating in New York under a false identity and had been arrested by the FBI in 1957. The two men walked toward each other from opposite ends of the bridge simultaneously. Powers returned to the United States to a reception that was notably cooler than he might have expected, with questions raised about why he hadn't activated his plane's self-destruct mechanism before capture. 82. The newspaper that the CIA-owned Operation Mockingbird covered a broad range of media assets, but here's the thing about the most direct forms of CIA media involvement. They went beyond cultivating journalists at existing outlets. The agency at various points owned or controlled actual publications, radio stations, and news services outright, particularly in foreign markets where influencing public opinion was considered a direct intelligence objective. Congress for Cultural Freedom, funded covertly by the CIA, published literary and intellectual magazines across Europe and Asia throughout the 1950s and 60s. Encounter magazine in Britain was among the most prominent. The editors of some of these publications knew about the CIA connection. Others apparently did not. When the funding was revealed through investigative reporting in 1967, the credibility damage extended not just to the specific publications, but to the broader community of intellectuals who had contributed to them in good faith, unaware their work was appearing in venues with undisclosed government sponsors. 83. The telephone tap on a king, the FBI's surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr., is one of the most thoroughly documented domestic intelligence abuses in American history. And here's the thing about the specific authorization chain behind it. It went all the way to the top. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had been concerned about alleged communist influence in the civil rights movement for years. In 1963, Attorney General Robert Kennedy authorized telephone wiretaps on King, believing or accepting Hoover's argument that a close King associate had Communist Party ties. The taps were authorized as a national security measure. They were subsequently expanded. The surveillance produced personal information about King that had no intelligence value whatsoever, which the FBI then used in attempts to discredit him. The anonymous letter urging King to take his own life was sent by the FBI in 1964, the same year King received the Nobel Peace Prize. The full King surveillance files remain partially sealed by court order until 2027. 84. The listening device in the Great Seal. Here's the thing about one of the most elegantly designed surveillance devices of the Cold War. It required no battery, no power source, and produced no signal unless it was being actively interrogated from outside. In 1945, Soviet schoolchildren presented American Ambassador Avril Harriman with a carved wooden replica of the Great Seal of the United States as a gesture of friendship. The gift was hung in the ambassador's private study at Spaso House in Moscow, where it remained for 7 years. In 1952, a British signals officer accidentally discovered that the seal contained a concealed listening device, a resonant cavity microphone, later known as the Thing, designed by Soviet scientist Leon Theremin. The device had no active components. A beam of radio waves directed at it from outside the building caused it to transmit audio from the room. It had been listening passively and invisibly for 7 years. The discovery fundamentally changed how American facilities abroad were swept for surveillance equipment. 85. The CIA's longest-running covert war. The CIA's involvement in Afghanistan during the 1980s is a chapter in intelligence history that shaped the world in ways still being sorted through today. And here's the thing about the scale of the operation. It became, by the mid-1980s, the largest covert action program the CIA had run since Vietnam. Operation Cyclone provided funding, weapons, and training to Afghan Mujahideen fighters, resisting the Soviet occupation that had begun in 1979. At its peak, the program channeled approximately $600 million annually through Pakistani intelligence to Afghan resistance groups. The Stinger portable anti-aircraft missiles provided through the program significantly degraded Soviet air power over Afghanistan. The Soviets withdrew in 1989. The fractured landscape left behind, multiple armed factions, devastated infrastructure, and competing regional powers, contributed to the conditions from which the Taliban emerged in the mid-1990s and from which al-Qaeda eventually operated. The operation achieved its immediate objective. Its longer-term consequences arrived on a separate timeline. 86. The email that wasn't encrypted. Here's the thing about the basic digital hygiene of intelligence officers in the early 2000s. It was, in several documented cases, considerably less rigorous than the sensitivity of their work required. Aldrich Ames had already demonstrated that lifestyle inconsistencies could go unreported for years. Robert Hansen had demonstrated that internal security procedures weren't uniformly applied. The digital era added new dimensions to the same underlying problem. CIA Director David Petraeus resigned in 2012 after an FBI investigation revealed he had shared classified notebooks with his biographer, with whom he was having an affair. The investigation had begun not through any intelligence channel, but through a routine cyber harassment inquiry. The classified materials were stored in an unsecured location. Petraeus pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge of mishandling classified information in 2015 and was sentenced to probation and a fine. The case illustrated that the human factors driving security failures, judgment, relationship, inattention, hadn't changed much regardless of the technology involved. 87. The vault that held the secrets of chaos. Operation Chaos had a physical dimension that is easy to forget in the abstract. And here's the thing about what the CIA actually built to manage the surveillance program. It maintained a computerized database called Hydra that stored the files on the approximately 7,200 American citizens the program had compiled dossiers on. Hydra was one of the earliest large-scale computerized intelligence databases, operational at a time when such systems were genuinely novel in government. The files contained information gathered from informants, mail intercepts, physical surveillance, and coordination with the FBI. When the Church Committee examined Operation Chaos, investigators noted that the database's existence meant the surveillance had a permanence and retrievability that handwritten files would not have had. The transition from paper files to computerized databases fundamentally changed the scale at which domestic surveillance could be conducted and the ease with which accumulated information could be searched, cross-referenced, and retrieved. A transition whose implications extended well beyond chaos itself. 88. The mole at the heart of the NSA, Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen, are the most famous American intelligence betrayals. But here's the thing about a case that received considerably less public attention. The espionage of Ronald Pelton, an NSA communications specialist who sold intelligence to the Soviet Union beginning in 1980. Pelton had resigned from the NSA in 1979 under financial pressure, taking no classified documents with him. What he took was what he carried in his memory: detailed knowledge of NSA collection programs, technical capabilities, and ongoing operations. He contacted the Soviet embassy in Washington shortly after his resignation. Among the programs he revealed was Operation Ivy Bells, a joint NSA-Navy operation that had tapped an undersea Soviet military communications cable in the Sea of Okhotsk. The tap had been functioning for years, producing significant intelligence. After Pelton's revelation, Soviet divers located and removed the listening device. Pelton was identified through a Venona-adjacent signals intercept, arrested in 1985, and sentenced to 3 concurrent life terms. 89. The country that didn't know it was a testing ground. Here's the thing about some of the CIA's Cold War programs. The people most affected by them were often the last to find out what had actually happened. In Guatemala, the full extent of American involvement in the 1954 coup was not formally acknowledged by the U.S. government until President Clinton's administration released documents in 1997 and offered a statement of regret. In Iran, the CIA's role in the 1953 coup was officially acknowledged by the State Department only in 2013, 60 years after the event. In both cases, the countries involved had their own historical understanding of what had happened, shaped by decades of indirect evidence, personal testimony, and leaked documents. The formal American acknowledgement, when it finally arrived, confirmed what many in those countries had believed for generations. The gap between what governments know about their own actions and what they're willing to formally acknowledge can, as these cases demonstrate, span the better part of a century. 90. The photograph that ended a career. Here's the thing about the value of photographic intelligence. Sometimes a single image carries more weight than volumes of analytical reporting. In the autumn of 1962, U-2 reconnaissance photographs taken over Cuba showed Soviet missile installation sites under construction. The images, analyzed by CIA photo interpreters who recognized the distinctive layout of Soviet medium-range ballistic missile sites from previous intelligence work, confirmed that the Soviet Union was placing offensive nuclear weapons 90 miles from the American coastline. President Kennedy was briefed on October 16th. So, the 13 days that followed the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world closer to nuclear war than at any point before or since, by most historians' assessments. The photographic evidence was central to every phase of the American response, from the initial decision to confront the Soviets to the presentation of evidence to Allied governments and the United Nations. The U-2 program, which had been politically embarrassing since Powers was shot down, Shah had just produced the most consequential intelligence of the Cold War. 91. The spy who wouldn't use a computer. Robert Hansen's insistence on never meeting his handlers in person and never allowing them to know his true identity is one of the stranger features of his case. And here's the thing about the additional precaution he took regarding digital technology. He refused to communicate electronically with his Soviet and Russian contacts at a time when such communication was becoming standard practice. His entire operation ran on physical dead drops and written notes. He was, professionally, a counterintelligence expert who understood exactly how electronic communications could be monitored and traced. That expertise informed his operational security in ways that made him harder to catch. The FBI eventually identified him not through communications, intercepts, or financial surveillance, but by purchasing a file from a former Russian intelligence officer that contained Hansen's fingerprints and a sample of his voice from a recorded conversation. The file cost the FBI $7 million. It is, arguably, the most expensive fingerprint identification in American law enforcement history. 92. The analyst who saw Able Archer. Clearly, the NATO military exercise called Able Archer 83 remains one of the most studied near misses of the nuclear age, and here's the thing about what made it genuinely dangerous. Soviet leadership in 1983 was not simply being paranoid in a vacuum. The early Reagan administration had significantly escalated its rhetoric about the Soviet Union, describing it as an evil empire and discussing the possibility of winning a nuclear exchange. American military operations had been probing Soviet air defenses. A Soviet early warning satellite had incorrectly flagged American missile launches in September of that year. An officer named Stanislav Petrov declined to report the alert up the chain of command, a decision that prevented an automatic response. When Able Archer began in November, simulating a nuclear release sequence with unusual realism, Soviet military units in Europe were placed on heightened alert. Gordievsky's reporting, combined with a subsequent presidential intelligence briefing, contributed to a genuine reassessment of how American military signaling was being read in Moscow. 93. Troy, the secret court nobody elected, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, established by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, is one of the more unusual features of the American legal system. And here's the thing about how it actually operates. The court consists of 11 federal district court judges appointed by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, serving staggered terms. It meets in a secure facility and hears applications for surveillance warrants from the government. For most of its history, the court approved the overwhelming majority of government applications, a fact critics cited as evidence that the adversarial process normal to American courts was essentially absent, since only the government presents arguments. After the Snowden disclosures revealed the court had been authorizing surveillance programs of enormous scope, including bulk collection of phone metadata, several former judges publicly defended the court's rigor. Others, including one sitting judge, wrote that the programs authorized had gone beyond what Congress had intended when it wrote the original statute. 94. The encryption war that wasn't really about encryption. Here's the thing about the Clipper chip controversy of the early 1990s. It was an early battle in a conflict between intelligence agencies and the technology sector that has never fully resolved. The Clinton administration proposed a hardware encryption chip that would be built into telecommunications devices and would encrypt communications effectively, but would also include a key escrow system allowing government agencies with proper legal authorization to decrypt any communication. The technology community objected strenuously. Privacy advocates argued the escrow keys themselves would become a target for foreign intelligence services and criminals. Cryptographers pointed out fundamental technical weaknesses. The proposal was eventually abandoned. The underlying tension between the intelligence community's need to access encrypted communications and individuals' and companies' desire for genuinely private digital communication became significantly more acute in the following decades as encryption spread from specialized government use to consumer smartphones and messaging applications used by billions of people. 95. The station that watched the wall. Here's the thing about the CIA's Berlin station during the Cold War. It occupied a particular position in the geography of American intelligence that gave it a character distinct from any other posting in the world. West Berlin was an island inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, surrounded on all sides by the Eastern Bloc, with direct physical proximity to the most heavily monitored border in the world. For decades, Berlin was among the most active intelligence environments on Earth. Both sides ran extensive human and technical collection operations, recruited assets across the divide, and attempted to penetrate each other's services. When the Berlin Wall fell on the night of November 9th, 1989, CIA officers at the station watched crowds dismantle a barrier that had defined their professional world for nearly 30 years. CERPI, the event that had not been predicted with specificity, had been building for years in ways the intelligence record, reviewed afterward, had captured imperfectly. The wall came down. The analytical files on why it hadn't come down sooner made for complicated reading. 96. The codebreaker who changed everything. Here's the thing about the contribution of signals intelligence to Allied victory in World War II. It is difficult to overstate without sounding like you're overstating it. The British code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park, which cracked the German Enigma cipher with significant contributions from Polish mathematicians who had done foundational work before the war, produced intelligence designated Ultra that informed Allied military planning at every level. American codebreakers worked in close partnership with Bletchley, and the collaboration produced an intelligence relationship between the US and Britain that survived the war and formed the basis for the UK-USA Agreement of 1946, the framework that eventually expanded into the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance among the US, Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The code-breaking work and the alliance it generated remained classified for decades. The mathematician most central to the Bletchley operation, Alan Turing, was prosecuted by the British government for his private life in 1952 and died in 1954. He received a formal royal pardon in 2013. 97. The assets who were never brought home. Here's the thing about the human cost of intelligence betrayals that gets lost in the institutional narratives. The assets who were exposed by Aldrich Ames were not abstractions. They were people who had made a decision to cooperate with American intelligence, often at significant personal risk, based in part on an implicit assurance that the organization they were working with could protect them. When Ames began passing their identities to Soviet intelligence in 1985, the CIA began noticing that assets were going quiet, missing contact schedules, failing to respond, disappearing from communication. An internal working group was formed to investigate the pattern of losses. The investigation moved slowly. By the time Ames was arrested in 1994, at least 10 people had been executed as a result of his betrayals. The CIA's internal review found that the working group had, at various points, been close to identifying Ames but had not followed the evidence where it led with sufficient urgency. The delay had a cost that cannot be expressed in institutional terms. 98. The document that redefined the rules. Here's the thing about Executive Order 12333. It is one of those government documents that most people have never heard of, and that nonetheless shapes consequential aspects of American foreign policy to this day. Signed by President Reagan in 1981, the order formalized the prohibition on assassination plots against foreign leaders that had been introduced after the Church Committee exposed the CIA's earlier programs. The prohibition had existed in various forms since Gerald Ford's executive order of 1976. Reagan's order extended and specified it. The order also defined the framework for covert action authorities and the relationship between the CIA and the National Security Council. In the post-September 11th environment, legal debates about the order's applicability to targeted killings of terrorism suspects, particularly American citizens, generated significant legal analysis within the executive branch, some of which was eventually released in redacted form. The order that had been written to constrain one kind of lethal operation was being interpreted in the context of an entirely different kind of conflict. 99. The satellite image anyone can see. Now, here's the thing about how completely the landscape of intelligence has changed since the Cold War era. In the 1960s, a photograph of Soviet military installations taken from orbit was among the most closely guarded secrets in the American government. Today, commercial satellite imagery of comparable or superior resolution is available to anyone with an internet connection and a credit card. Companies including Planet Labs, Maxar, and others operate fleets of commercial imaging satellites that photograph virtually every location on Earth with a frequency and resolution that would have been the exclusive province of national intelligence agencies 30 years ago. Journalists, researchers, and governments without space programs use commercial imagery to document military buildups, humanitarian crises, and environmental changes in real time. The democratization of overhead imagery has changed the nature of open source intelligence profoundly. Some of what once required a classified program costing hundreds of millions of dollars can now be accomplished with a commercial subscription. The intelligence community's monopoly on seeing the Earth from above ended quietly sometime in the 2000s without a formal announcement. 100. The archive that's still being opened. The declassification of historical intelligence documents is an ongoing process, and here's the thing about what that process actually looks like in practice. It is slower, more complicated, and more incomplete than the phrase declassified documents tends to imply. The National Declassification Center, established in 2009 to accelerate the review of historically significant classified materials, has processed tens of millions of pages. The CIA's CREST database, CIA Records Search Tool, contains millions of declassified documents available for public search. The JFK Assassination Records Collection, mandated by a 1992 Act of Congress, has been released in batches across multiple administrations, with successive presidents citing national security concerns to delay portions of the release. As of 2023, some documents in that collection remain withheld. What the still classified materials contain is, by definition, unknown. What the released materials have already shown is that the distance between official history and documentary record is, in many cases, considerable. Every batch of newly released files has a way of quietly revising something that seemed settled. 101. The 30 million pages nobody read. And here, at the end of this long, quiet journey, here's the thing that ties all of it together. The 30 million pages the CIA has declassified represent not an ending, but a partial opening. Most of those pages have never been read by anyone outside the small community of historians and researchers who know they exist and have the patience to work through them. They sit in digital archives and physical reading rooms, available in principle to anyone with the time and inclination to look. Inside them are the details behind every operation discussed here, and hundreds that haven't been. The names of assets who were never publicly acknowledged. The internal debates that preceded decisions whose consequences lasted decades. The assessments that were right but ignored, and the ones that were wrong but acted upon. The CIA has released over 30 million pages of declassified documents. Most people will never read a single one. But somewhere in those pages, the full story is waiting, patient, filed, and stamped in faded ink with a date that someone once considered the future. So tonight, rest easy knowing you've never been handed a carved wooden seal with something listening inside it, never had to cross the Gleanica Bridge wondering if the other side would hold up their end of the deal, and never spent $20 million discovering that cats are, in fact, ungovernable. Somewhere in a reading room, 30 million pages are waiting for someone patient enough to turn them over. A resonant cavity microphone sat in an ambassador's study for 7 years without anyone noticing. A grocery bag once changed the fate of at least 10 lives in a single afternoon. History is strange and quiet and closer than it looks. The files are open, the ink is faded, and somewhere between the last fact and the first dream, the truth is still being declassified. Sweet dreams.